students against mining expansion are opposed to Measure A, the mining plan approved by the Azusa City Council. As our name suggests, we are against any plan that expands mining within Azusa. The plan was originally described as an equal swap of 80 acres on the east for 80 acres on the west. However, it turns out that 20 acres from the east have already been mined, so it's really not an equal swap. According to the draft EIR, the amount of rock reserves produced under the 2010 plan is less than that of the 1988 plan. However, Vulcan later lowered the 121 million tons to 106.5 million tons. Lilburn, the EIR consultant, later lowered this value amount to 84 million tons. However, they realized that this meant it really was a mining expansion plan, and so raised it back to 107 million tons 2 weeks later. More on this in a few minutes. One of the first things we noticed in Vulcan's models was the vast difference between the appearance of the west and east side. As you can see here, the east side on the right looks much smaller than that on the left, so that it would yield much less rock than that on the west. Is that true? Now we're going to look at the heights of the east and the west properties. The highest point on the east is 1,800 feet, whereas the highest point on the west is over 2,000 feet. The lowest points on the east are around 800 feet, whereas the lowest point on the west is 1,400 feet, fully 600 feet higher than on the east. Since the areas are equal, these elevations clearly show that there must be more rock on the west 80 acres. Not only that, but mining the east side, shown here, requires sloping both sides, further reducing the amount of mineable rock. In addition, Vulcan's model and the mining plans in the EIR clearly show that the boundary constraints require that the mining cannot be as deep on the east side, since there is a 200-foot elevation rise from the mining on the vast majority of the east side property. So not only is the east side mountain smaller than the west, but it cannot be mined as deeply. This figure comes from the 2010 mining plan and represents the final contours after all mining has been completed. The area in green is the westerly 80 acres. If we take the scale, we can see and measure the width of the property, a little over 1,300 feet. Remember that number. The B to B prime line represents the west to east slice through the west side of the quarry, which we'll look at in the next slide. This figure is that slice. We look at the bottom scale and mark off 1,300 feet to determine the boundary of the 80 acres compared to the 2010 plan. If we draw a line representing a 1-to-1 slope from the boundary to the bottom, we see the amount of rock in yellow available under the current plan. The area in green represents the amount of rock available under the 2010 plan. Since Vulcan says the amount of total rock is 105 million tons, we can see that the amount available under the 1988 plan is about 16 million tons compared to about 90 million tons available under the 2010 plan. In our notice of preparation comments, we specifically asked for extraction data for the east side under the 1988 plan, which Vulcan, Lilburn, the EIR consultant, and the City of Azusa conveniently ignored. So we found our data in a 2005 Greystone report. This figure comes from Vulcan's 2005 plan to mine the entire 270 acres of the project site, which looks quite similar to the 2010 plan, but with full mining of the east side included. Again, we have a north-south side section through the 80 acres, which is shown on the bottom figure. This is a comparison of both slices, the top one from the westerly 80 acres and the bottom one from the east, drawn exactly to the same scale. If we superimpose the 1988 east side mining slice on the one from the west, we see that it represents about half that produced under the 2010 mining plan. So it is clear that the amount of rock produced from the east and west properties are not equal. In addition, we can see on this graph that mining on the east side extends only down to 1,050 feet, whereas mining on the west side extends all the way down to 800 feet, as shown previously. With this data, we convinced the City of Duarte to hire a geologist to accurately determine the volumes of rock produced under the two plans. These are the results of the AGI report, showing the present contours, final 1988 contours, and the cut contours, showing that the east property would yield about 40 million tons of rock under the 1988 plan. Likewise, these are the present contours, final 1988 contours, and cut contours of the west side property under the 1988 plan, yielding a total of 16 million tons of rock. The table here is a summary of the aggregate available under the 1988 plan versus the 2010 plan. So the 2010 plan nearly doubles the rock reserves available to Vulcan. This table shows the confused aggregate volume measurements by Vulcan Materials and the so-called independent EIR consultant hired by the city. On the east side, Vulcan Materials Company gave a much larger estimate of rock compared to AGI, which was quite close, however, to Lilburn's estimate. On the west side, Vulcan Materials' volume was virtually identical to AGI's, although Lilburn gave a volume that was 2.5 times the other two values. All of the values indicated that the 2010 plan was an expansion of mining compared with the 1988 plan. So 2 weeks later, Lilburn did another calculation in which they magically found an additional 44 million tons on the east side. Although the city, Vulcan Materials, and Lilburn claimed the EIR was based on science, these desperate measures are not what one would expect from any kind of real science. So the take-home message from all this data is that the mining plan approved by the Azusa City Council does expand mining in the city of Azusa. The development agreement does provide for a number of financial incentives to the city of Azusa. However, the mining rate on aggregate was not changed from the current rate. Instead, Measure A provides for advanced tax payments to the city up to $5 million. However, should Vulcan stop mining, any advance payments in excess of the claimed mining tonnage would have to be paid back with interest. Much more troubling than this is the clause in the development agreement that specifically forgives Vulcan Materials Company from any past financial claims, including any unpaid past mining taxes, which we will examine next.